All right, well, I think what we'll do, if anybody sees admit on the screen here while I'm chatting with you guys momentarily, let me know and I'll let them in. First of all, thank you everybody for joining us this evening. Dr. Pollock and I were reminiscing. I think this is year number 10 that he's actually doing a Winter Wednesday for us. So 10 years in a row, even during COVID, we organized these evenings so that could learn a little bit more about some topics that they may or may not be intimately familiar with. Dr. Pollock is a longtime friend of ours and has done seminars on everything from thermal stress and age and diving and fitness and diving. And we've had all sorts of really good topics, which is cool. And this evening's I thought was always good. I love topics that usually have to do with our bodies and diving, because that is often the limiting factor in the activity that we're participating in. The environment is one, and our bodies and how it interacts with that environment is the other. So I thought, well, the myths and facts of diving physiology sounded like it would be very engaging as a topic. And Dr. Pollock has always found a great way to deliver some of this information to us, obviously with lots of fun anecdotes and so on. I'm going to let Dr. Pollock do a brief bio on himself, but when I first met him, he was the head guy at Divers Alert Network in terms of hyperbaric research and stuff like that. So he's very, very familiar. He's now at the University of Laval, but I'll let him give you the particulars, and then we'll be able to dive right into tonight's conversation. So with that, Dr. Pollock, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Brad. I appreciate that intro. And I think that's the only thing I can say. I am at the University of Laval, and I am not a Francophone. So they were crazy enough to recruit an Anglophone to take on a research chair in hyperbaric and diving medicine. So I'm still not quite sure how that happened, but I am Canadian. So coming back north was good, but language is tough. So tonight we're going to be talking about mostly myths and misconceptions, because the reality is there aren't that many facts in diving. As soon as someone tells you that they know a fact about diving, you should be suspicious, because one of the things that we know that all knowledge evolves, and we have a lot more theory and understanding than we have true hardcore down to the second decimal place fact. But let's see what we can do with this. When we think about the myths and the misconceptions, we can find these anywhere, any field. You can take your pick. They're really noticeable in diving because there's so much ego and conversation in diving. So it's not that this is the only place you can find them, but it is a challenge here. And it does really confirm the importance that we have to be critical when I say critical, I'm not saying negative. I'm saying we have to really thoughtfully evaluate all of the bits of information we're given, because they're not always right. People can really truly believe in things that may not be valid. And physiology is a really good example of this, because a lot of what goes on is invisible to us. We have to be very careful not to assume something just because it sounds good or somebody made it sound good when they talk to you. So what I think we have to start with are the rules for evaluating claims. We really need to look for data. When we hear something and it's presented as a fact or a truth or a novel insight, we have to really look at the data that it's based on. We have to look for bias. And it's not that people will intentionally be biased, but we are all biased in so many ways. So we have to look for the bias and make sure we control it. And I think the most important thing is we have to avoid lying to ourselves. That's probably the biggest thing that gets us in trouble. We aren't honest with ourselves when things are going wrong, and it can tend to progress. When I'm evaluating claims or when I'm hearing people talk about them, there are two things that I think you should always be aware of. If someone says, as their justification for something, that I've always done it this way, or my instructor told me, you should give that a high level of suspicion. If that's the only thing they have to support a claim, that's a problem. And again, it's not that instructors or leaders try to be misleading, but we would like students and participants to have a much better foundation so they can actually talk through the arguments to make sure that what they're trying to believe in is legitimate. So let's look at the misconceptions. Misconceptions, to me, there are a fair number of them about diving, but I'm less concerned about these. These are the things that are often overcome with just a small bit of knowledge. And if you think about things, you can go online and look up the myths or misconceptions of diving, and you'll get this kind of list. The people who say, I can't dive because my ears hurt when I go to the bottom of a pool. Well, yeah, so do everybody else's until they learn to equalize. So this list here, I can't dive because I have claustrophobia. Divers breathe pure oxygen. You have to go deep to make it interesting. You have to go to the tropics to make it interesting. These are things with just a little bit of knowledge people figure out as not being true. And so I don't worry about these misconceptions. These take care of themselves. It's the myth that is much more concerning because these are really difficult to correct. Often there isn't a great evidence base for or against. And so it's really whoever has the loudest voice who's often given the credit. And so we sometimes have very experienced people who will posit things that in the light of day they just don't hold up. But boy, they sound convincing. And they can sometimes spin a compelling argument, even if it's not valid. And sometimes these are created innocently. Sometimes, though, they're created because people want to be viewed as expert. And so they'll come up with what they think might be a novel insight that everybody missed. And before you know it, it's promoted as some kind of underlying truth. And those are the difficult ones because this kind of misunderstanding can work its way into the community and end up with people having problems. And the reason I say that is because most of these problematic myths aren't about the minor things. They're often associated with the things that can have the highest health impact on the divers. And we'll use decompression stress as the primary example. It is amazing what some people try to suggest as their great insight and why they're smarter than everybody else. And in some cases, they get away with it. In some cases, they get injured. And in some cases, people die. And I could give you examples of all three where the myths, the false beliefs have ended up creating really negative outcomes. And we want to avoid that. And so my goal is never to talk about a case by case set of examples. I'd rather get people to collectively be aware that they have to be critical in evaluating information to make sure that they're not going down that rabbit hole. So let's talk about the big ones. And when I say big ones, the ones that can have a pretty big health impact if we get it wrong. And so let's start by looking at some elements of decompression stress. So something that was very commonly heard on dive boats and is still heard on dive boats is that dehydration is the number one cause of decompression sickness. And we've fought against this one for a long time, and it still comes up. We were diving last year on a boat, and damn if they didn't say this. And people believe it, but it is absolutely untrue. And the example I give, you can be so dehydrated that you look like a raisin. But if you don't have a significant dive profile, you will not get decompression sickness. So there is no way in the world that dehydration is the number one cause. It is a factor, but it's a relatively small factor. And if people focus on this idea of dehydration as something they have to avoid, they might drink so much that they actually increase their risk of emergent pulmonary edema, because that's one of the things that is increasingly likely when you hyperhydrate. So we have to be rational about this. And the reality is, for decompression, the dive profile is the big elephant in the room. That is the most important. And sure, state of hydration is on the list, but we are talking about a tiny bit player in a list of 24 variables. And so we can't focus exclusively on one thing, thinking that we're going to solve the problems, because then we can sometimes miss bigger problems. So the rational view for dehydration is simple. We do want people to have adequate hydration, but adequate hydration doesn't mean you're tossing down huge volumes of liquid, and especially not immediately before a dive. It actually takes about 30 minutes before fluid will clear from your stomach into your bloodstream. And so if you think, I want to hydrate myself, and just before you drop into the water, you chug 500 mils of fluid, almost all of that is immediately going to the bladder, and you're just going to have to be one of those people peeing in your wetsuit or dry suit. So if you want to hydrate, you hydrate well away from diving. You make sure your hydration levels are reasonable, and then you actually aren't in a bad state if you don't drink in that last half hour before you dive. You will not have to worry about dehydration, and it certainly isn't a major concern, but you also won't have quite as much fluid volume to deal with on the dive. So we have to make sure that we're not hyper-focused on something and creating difficulties. And this is a picture of urine samples. And this was during a week of studying technical divers. And you can see that these samples are arranged from a very pure fluid on the left to a very, very dark fluid on the right. Now, urine isn't a true reflection of state of hydration because we sacrifice our urine volume to protect our plasma volume. But if you're the kind of person that every morning, the first time you pee, you look like that case on the right, you should be drinking more. But if you're anywhere on the left half of those colors on your first morning pee, you are probably reasonably well hydrated, and it is not something that needs more hydration. You're in good shape here. Last thing I'll say about urine, you can't actually use the color during the day as an indication of hydration because the short-term effects will alter it. For example, if you step into a cold room for 15 minutes, you will vasoconstrict, you will get a fluid rush to the central volume to your chest, and ultimately you will quickly produce more urine. And so the first urination 15 or 30 minutes later will look like it's the color you see on the far left. That doesn't mean it's a true reflection of your state because it's influenced by the short-term events. So when we look at urine as a rough indicator of intake, we only look at the first morning sample. After a good night's sleep, what color is it? If it's a light pale yellow, that's all you need to worry about. You do not have to drink excessively. You've got a good base. Okay. Next decompression one. Deep stops improve decompression safety. This has, again, been going around for 20 years, and we started to make progress against this myth, but there are still people who are holding out because they like the idea. The idea of deep stops was simple. If we stop quite a bit deeper, we will control bubble formation. And that's good in theory. The problem is those deep stops were done so deep that they were done at a point where you wouldn't get bubble formation anyway. But you're also so deep that any unsaturated tissue is still going to take up inert gas. So you're actually increasing your later risk as you go shallow. And so deep stops sounded really good, but the research evidence is quite clear now. And when I say research evidence, there were a couple of really crappy papers that were published that suggested they were good. But since then, there have been a reasonable number of high quality papers, and every one of them has shown that the risk associated with deep stops is increased. And so we don't promote them anymore, but this is one of those 20-year projects to try to get it out of the mindset of the divers, because we have a lot of leaders, and I'm not trying to pick on instructors, but they are often the leaders. And if we have someone who became an instructor 10 or 20 years ago, they may be into continuing education, or they may be relying on their initial understanding and stopping there. We have a problem if we have people who hang on to the old things and don't upgrade based on new information. And I think that's the problem with deep stops. We have too many people who got excited about them 20 years ago, and now they're just hard over thinking it's the best thing since sliced bread. And they aren't. One of the worst things about them is how they're defined. And I'll Naui is a good example of this. Naui was deciding when they first implemented the deep stops how they should do it so they were easy for the divers to understand. And what they thought was, well, why don't we just use half the depth for our deep stop? And if you think about a 100-foot depth, half the depth is 50 feet. But if you think about it from a pressure point of view, 100 feet, 30 meters is about 4 atmospheres. 2 atmospheres is 10 meters. So if you look at half the pressure, that deep stop should be at 33 feet. And I think you can understand very clearly that if you are making a simple rule just so people can follow it easier, it can be in violation of the physiology when you're saying, I'm going to stop at 50 feet for my first stop instead of 33 because it's simpler for people to compute. That is a silly thing. And it is better on deeper dives. If you're diving to 300 feet, there's not as much difference. But if you're diving in the recreational zone, half the depth is actually way too deep and you're still taking on inert gas. So if you're doing that as a deep stop, you are increasing your risk. So the rational view, you have to remember, every minute you spend at depth, and when I say at depth, that would be any depth where tissues aren't fully saturated, they're taking on inert gas. So what you really want to do is finish what you intend or want to do in the bottom, and then start getting out of there, because staying down too long is just increasing the stress. And if you do want to start to look at where should I be thinking about my first stop, you need to look at the pressure difference, the relative pressure change. Comparing depth, like saying half the maximum depth, is just not rational. Okay, one of my personal favorites, and we see this anytime we have somebody coming into the chamber who has symptoms of decompression sickness. They will often say, oh, but my computer said it was okay. Or other people might believe that following their computer will guarantee that they will not develop decompression sickness. Neither of those statements are true. And if you get symptoms of decompression sickness when you're adhering to the dive computer, you shouldn't be saying this was an undeserved hit. You have to look at the profile. If you're diving deeper than 40 or 50 feet, really, let's say 50 feet, if you get symptoms of DCS, the word undeserved probably shouldn't be in your vocabulary, because you have enough provocation on that exposure that, yes, you fell on the bad side of the probabilistic curve, but that doesn't mean it's undeserved. It means you got unlucky, or maybe you did deserve it and you just don't realize it. But so people who think that dive computers keep them safe are at a disadvantage, because dive computers are really good at measuring the pressure time profile, but they're easily 15 or 18 different factors in decompression stress that no dive computer is able to measure. And so just because you are adhering to the dive computer algorithm doesn't guarantee safety. And this is why you should be building in those safety buffers. So any compression decompression cycle does produce decompression stress. And when people come in and they say, but my computer said it was okay, the first thing we have to ask is, what model was it and what conservative settings did you have? To just say I followed my computer is absolutely uninformative to people. So if you do want to be aware, and if you do want to be prepared, if you do have a problem, you should know what algorithm your dive computer uses, and you should know what your conservative settings are. I find very, very often when I ask people what their conservative settings are, they have no idea. They set them sometime in the past, and they don't look at them. And of course, they could be changed by them or by someone else. And and they may not be aware of it. And that is a problem. For me, it's important to understand that dive computers are tools, but they are not smart tools. They're actually quite dumb tools. And so we have to be the smart people running them. We can't let them run us. So the rational view. Don't worry if you get symptoms. Dive computers don't get DCS, so they'll do just fine. We've never had to treat a dive computer for DCS, so they recover beautifully. But what you really want to do is build in your buffers, because you can't trust the base algorithm. Some people say, well, they wouldn't put an algorithm in that was unsafe. You have to understand that a lot of the algorithms that go in computers have never actually been man tested. Many of them were mathematically derived and then implemented. And there is no guarantee of safety. If we wanted to develop a table that guaranteed that everybody would be safe, it would be so restrictive that it would be absolutely unacceptable. So there is no guarantee of decompression safety. So again, if you're diving deeper than 40 or certainly 50 feet, you've got a possibility of decompression sickness. It's as simple as that. So build in the safety buffers to minimize that risk. Okay, now let's turn to the other side of the coin. Some people say, oh yeah, I get it. People complain about these models, but I've never had a problem. And I don't worry about bubbles because bubbles occur after every dive. That's not true. That is absolutely untrue. The development of bubbles are based on some threshold, and that threshold is dynamic based on the profile and your personal factors and your thermal status and your exercise intensity and the timing of the exercise intensity. But there is a threshold. If you can stay below that threshold and you don't generate measurable bubbles, your chance of developing symptoms is very, very small. So that's the goal. We can't eliminate the risk, but what we can do is try to help people understand that they can minimize it. So the rational view is that there is a progressive risk as dives get deeper and longer, but you can control it. Now, for the people who say bubbles occur after every dive, this is a dive profile of a recreational dive to 515 feet. So it's a recreational dive to 157 meters. And this is using a Buhlmann model. So for those of you who are familiar with gradient factors, the gradient factor setting was 3075. And this is a scan of the heart. And we did serial scans following the dives. And if you look in there, there is not a bubble in sight. So this is what you can do with conservative decompression. Even with a 500-foot dive, we can have people coming up with virtually no bubbles. And again, if you have no bubbles, we can be fairly confident you won't develop symptoms. And again, we wouldn't know that after one scan, but we scan people at 15 or 20-minute intervals for a minimum of 2 hours. And if we can do that for 2 hours and not see any bubbles, it is very unlikely that that person is going to develop any symptoms. So for the people who say bubbles occur after every dive, it's not true. We have literally hundreds of clips of dives with no bubbles, but then we have a lot with bubbles. And what we know with the highest grade of bubbles, they're probably associated with about a 40% probability of symptoms. So it's not 100%. Bubbles do not equal DCS, and that's this next point. Some people say, oh my God, I have bubbles. Do I have to get treated? No. When we do research studies and we have bubbles, we just continue to monitor. We don't treat bubbles. But if we wanted to give people advice, they would be far better off to dive a profile that generated fewer or no bubbles than more or a whole bunch of bubbles. And so we don't treat bubbles, but we use them as a warning. They're the canary in the coal mine. When you have bubbles, we think it's probably a good idea, if you think about your procedures, to try to make changes that could reduce that load. So we do see bubbles in a fair number of cases, but they're definitely not found after every dive. Our goal is to try to give people the tools, so even if they're not measuring their bubbles, they can be making smart decisions that are likely to reduce them if they were to be measured. So the rational view, we don't treat bubbles, but yes, if you have high grade bubbles, and the way to find this out, by the way, if you get a chance, volunteer for a research study. And if you volunteer for a research study of decompression, when they're monitoring post-dive bubbles, you can get a really good idea as to whether or not you tend to be bubble resistant or bubble prone. And divers can go both ways. If you tend to be bubble prone, it's a really good idea to be thinking about ways to improve your safety. I always tell people you should dive as though you have a patent frame in O'Valley and as though you bubble, and then add buffers accordingly so you're on the low end of the risk spectrum. Now, this is a plot, just to drive home that point, that shows the difference between decompression sickness and bubbles. So these were flying after diving trials that we conducted at Duke University. And the purple line is decompression sickness. We were one of the 2 labs in North America that actually took our studies to the endpoint of symptoms. So we actually had ethical approval to bend divers. And the reason for that is that we were really good at unbending them. And so it wasn't even considered an adverse event if we had bent divers. That was a normal outcome of the study. And we treated them and we got rid of the bubbles and we got great data. So this is a plot of actual data. And what you can see on the purple line, if you go out in service interval to 22 hours and then it goes down to 18, 15, 6, and 3, you can see at 3 hours, there's a spike upward. What we're looking for in these studies is the point at which we get the inflection. Where do we go from virtually no cases of DCS to a lot of cases? And you can see here that when we had people flying 3 hours after they dived, we had a big jump in symptoms. It went up to 22% of the subjects developed DCS. That's a big number. But the white line that you can see there is the plot of venous gas emboli. And if you now look out at 22 hours, you'll see that we had 17% of the subjects with measurable bubbles. Well, you might say, if you were using bubbles as your endpoint, oh my God, we've got to stop this study. We're just putting people at risk. But you can see that we actually had a decrease in bubbles, then they went up, and then they spiked to 76%, and then came back down. These data are a little bit messy because they show one of the realities of working with divers. In these studies, divers couldn't repeat a given profile, but they could come back and repeat a different profile. And so imagine this, a diver who gets bent on a study where they have a 15-hour surface interval between their dive and their flight, they may say, okay, I found my limit, I'm done. I'm not going to play anymore. Whereas someone who didn't have symptoms might say, hey, I'm going to go a little shorter. I'll keep going. And so what we have the possibility of is data censoring. When we're dealing with human subjects, it's often not as neat as we might like it. And so the reason you're seeing, or one of the possible reasons you're seeing these wild curves for up and down could be because of a little bit of data censoring. We can't rule that out. And this is why we don't trust bubble data to tell us a good story. Symptomatic DCS tells a pretty good story. Somebody gets symptoms, we know we definitely hit a limit. And this next shot actually splits out the bubbles. And so here you see an extra blue line that has been added. And this blue line is for grade 3 and 4 bubbles only, the highest grades of bubbles as determined by oral Doppler. And you have to squint a little bit, but I think it will make sense that the blue line is at least a little bit closer to the purple line. It's still not perfect, but the point I'm trying to make is when we have somebody who has low grade bubbles, grade 1 or grade 2, we really can't associate those with decompression sickness at all. But if you've got grade 3 or grade 4, we're back to that maybe up to a 40% probability of DCS. And so I'm just trying to give you an example where we have some real data. We can definitely tell a good story based on data, not just based on hand waving. So we know how to bend people. We know how to unbend them, and we know how those bubbles may or may not associate with the DCS. Okay, next myth that people kick around is that nitrox is safer than air. And this is a challenging one because it may be true, but it also can be very definitely false. All you're doing with nitrox is you're replacing some of the nitrogen with a little bit of oxygen. And so you're reducing the amount of inert gas uptake. That is good from the point of view of decompression safety. But nitrox tables are generated simply by making a mathematical correction. And so if you go to the limit of nitrox tables, it is exactly the same risk as going to the limit of air tables. And so we can look at that one of two ways. If I want to dive to nitrox limits, I have no advantage in safety, but I get more bottom time. If I do the same dive, say a 30-minute dive to 60 feet on nitrox versus air, the dive on nitrox is safer because I have less inert gas uptake. So nitrox is tricky. The marketing, I think, has been disingenuous when they say nitrox is a safer gas, because it really depends on how you use it. If you use nitrox on air tables, it's a safer gas. If you use nitrox on nitrox tables, it's basically the same risk if you're going to the limits. So it really does depend on how it dives, how you dive it. If you're using that equivalent air depth concept, that's just a mathematical correction. If you dive to those limits, you're not improving your safety. But the rational view, if you use nitrox and you stay within the air limits for that depth, you are definitely reducing your risk. And as we get a little bit older, we get less fit, we want to worry less about decompression stress. That's not a bad strategy. To use nitrox on dives you used to do on air is in your best interests. Just don't fool yourself into thinking that nitrox is safer than it is. It's only safer when you compare it to the same dive on air, not if you dive it to the limit of equivalent air depth tables. Oh, stand by.
Oh,
Uh-oh.
well, we've got the screen on ours now.
Yeah, it's looking good here.
Okay, I have to exit out because it's showing some hidden screens.
Okay, go for it. We're not going anywhere.
Okay, we're back to where we were. Now, I mentioned gradient factors, and I hope that most of the people who are coming to seminars like this are familiar with gradient factors. But gradient factors, to me, are a really nice safety feature that was, or a conservatism feature that was generated with Buhlmann models. And all you're really doing with gradient factors is you're saying, you know, I understand that the M value, the theoretical amount of supersaturation beyond which bad things happen, I understand that that's a theoretical limit. It's not a true limit. And all gradient factors do is they dial back your allowed exposure to a percentage of that maximum. And so when we're talking about a gradient factor, we normally have two numbers, the low, gradient factor low, and gradient factor high. If you're within the no decompression limit, the gradient factor low has zero impact because it doesn't even kick in. But if you're doing decompression dives, by setting this combination, the first number, the GF low, will drive when you first stop. And then once you leave that stop, GF high won't be surpassed, or if you don't violate the model, it won't allow you to go beyond that percentage of the max. And that is advantageous. If we look at a plot of gradient factors, if we have somebody who believes in deep stops and they believe they're pretty bulletproof, they may set a gradient factor combination of 1585. What this is doing, if you look at that first stop value, what this is doing is it's making you stop very early in your ascent. So think of it, this yellow line on the bottom is really your bottom. And coming off the bottom, if you're at 1585, it's forcing you to stop when you're not that far off the bottom. And that means, again, any unsaturated tissue is still taking on inert gas. So that's problematic. If you're going up to 85% of the limit, if it's allowing you to get there, you're getting pretty close to a limit that we know is not universally true. As you get older, less fit, you work on the dive, your thermal stress is not optimal, your exercise is not optimal. You can be pushing yourself far too close or over the edge. So 1585 is for someone who likes deep stops and is bulletproof. If you instead want to go to something like 3070, the most important thing of that is where you start. That 3070 means basically you get your ass off the bottom. You get your ass off the bottom so you stop taking on excess inert gas as much. And so if we are doing our first stop at 30% of the M value, we're able to get further off the bottom so we have less ongoing uptake. And then by limiting it to 70% of the M value, it means that we have a pretty nice buffer here that hopefully will keep us out of trouble. And so we can, on a lot of dive computers, set the gradient factors so you can adjust your own risk tolerance. And this is a powerful tool. If you haven't looked at these, I encourage you to consider doing so. Most people, I think, are using computers now, but take a look at your computer, find out what's possible, and look carefully at your conservatism settings. If you're using an RGBM model and its conservative settings are 0 through 5, those actually don't make a lot of physiological sense, because when you're more conservative, it actually pushes deep stops. And so the RGBM model is not for casual recreational diving, shallower than 100 feet. They're not horrible, but they don't make as much physiological sense to me. The RGBM model is a black box that wasn't shared publicly, and the conservative settings are hard to figure out. When I have a research subject and they tell me their gradient factors, I get a pretty good idea of what I might see with their bubble scores based on the changes to their gradient factors. I can't get the same insight with the RGBM factors because they don't follow the same simple logic. They're trickier. Okay, let's turn away from straight decompression stress and look at something very Canadian, thermal stress. Ontario, hey, we go from Quebec to Ontario to get the warm water diving for a lot of the year. But because the Saguenay here, we've been there in July and it's 1 degree in the water. And that's just wrong. You should get some break in the summertime, but we don't. So you end up with these cold water dives. So what about this? One of the myths that people believe in is they think that their dive computers are somehow computing their thermal status in calculating their decompression obligation. And let me tell you, there's not a computer out there that does this. The simplest way I can illustrate it, you could be wearing the same computer wearing a dry suit and full undergarments or wearing a bikini. And, your thermal protection is completely different. The computer doesn't know the difference. When a computer is giving you water temperature, that's all it's giving you. It is not giving you your thermal stress. And there is no algorithm out there right now that has any meaningful calculation of the impact of thermal status on decompression risk. But this is a big factor. And so first thing to remember, dive computers don't measure thermal status. They measure at best water temperature. And we are going to be probably still decades away from getting full physiological models that can truly evaluate our risk. And okay, I'm going to come to an image shortly. Right now, let me give you another myth. Some people think that being warmer is always safer. And this is a problem in decompression in cold water diving because we have to struggle against the behavior, the preference, the prioritization of comfort over safety. Sometimes being warmer is higher risk. And so I'm not saying people shouldn't use active heating garments, the battery operated garments, but I will say that if you're going to use them, you have to be really mindful of the implications, because being warmer is not always safe. One of the problems of being warm is that it increases your peripheral circulation. If you're warm at depth and you have increased circulation, it means you have more inert gas uptake. And so being warm at depth actually increases your nitrogen uptake. That will be costly in the long run. And so the rational view, you have to have enough thermal protection so you can do the dive you want to do. I mean, you need enough protection to make it work, but you shouldn't be prioritizing comfort to the point that you forget that there are negative implications on your decompression safety. And this is a summary slide that shows one of the most elegant designs, the most elegant work that we have that demonstrates the impact of thermal stress. So this was done by the US Navy in Panama City, Florida, and they divided their dive. So they did this in a habitat, in a wet pot that they were able to quickly change the water temperature in. And they divided the dive into two phases. There was the descent and bottom phase, and then there was the ascent and stop phase. And they would keep those temperatures either cooler warm or cooler warm on the two ends. And you have to remember one thing. If you look at the water temperatures, they call warm 36 degrees C, which is true, but you have to realize that these are Floridian wimps. So they call cold water 27 degrees C. And so this is a bit of a problem when you're dealing with the southern end of America, that they don't really understand cold. So this is cool, but it is meaningful because your mean skin temperature is 32 degrees C. And so you are chilling when you're in 27 degrees C water, but it really should be called cool. Now, this was a dive to 37 meters, 120 feet, for 30 minutes. And then they exercised on the bottom almost continuously. And then they had a super long decompression, so they wouldn't have to change that decompression depending on what else changed in the dive profile. Now, I hope this makes sense to you. If we think of decompression risk, the highest risk was if a diver went down warm and was warm throughout the descent and bottom phase, and then they were cool during the ascent and stop phase. And the reason why that is high risk, being warm on the way down in the bottom, they have maximal uptake of inert gas because they have maximal vasodilation and delivery of blood to the periphery. So they take up a lot of inert gas. But if they then change the water temperature and they're cool on the way up, they now vasoconstrict and they don't remove that inert gas from the peripheral tissues. So that is the worst combination, being warm-cold. Well, being cold-cold is a little bit safer because if you're cold on the way down, you don't take up the gas. Being warm-warm is pretty good. You're still taking up a lot of inert gas when you're warm, but if you're warm on the way up, you do eliminate it. So that is better. But the safest scenario was for the divers to go down cool and to come up warm. Because if they were cool on the way down, they didn't take up as much inert gas. And then if they were warm on the way up, they off-gassed quite effectively. Now, when people look at this, they often say, okay, I get it, but I don't care. I want to be comfortable. Well, here's why you should care. In this study, for the warm-cold group, they were able to do a 30-minute dive, so 30 minutes at 37 meters, and they bent 22% of their subjects. That's a pretty big percentage of decompression sickness. Now, if they sent the divers down cool and brought them up warm, they were able to increase the bottom time to 70 minutes. They more than doubled the bottom time and only had 1% DCS. So for the people who say, I don't care, I want to be warm and comfortable, you have to understand that there's a potentially large cost. This is not a small effect. You have behind your dive profile your two biggest risk factors are probably the way you exercise during the dive, when and how much, and your thermal status, when and how much, whether you're cold, whether you're warm, and whether it's on the way down or the way up. So those are very complicating factors. No dive computer can sense them. So it relies on the diver to be aware of what they're doing and to make changes in real time. The worst thing about the cold stress is that when people are cold, they are encouraged to make bad decisions and say, blow off the last bit of the decompression or safety stop to get to the surface faster. In reality, if you're cold during that stop, that's when you should be staying longer. But here's where we have to fight against our tendency to comfort. But these numbers, I hope, are compelling. They were able to double the bottom time and had an order of magnitude less DCS. And this is, again, this is symptomatic DCS. These are not bubbles. This is symptoms. They're the other lab in North America, in the US, that takes studies to the endpoint of symptoms. So thermal status is important, and we have to be mindful of it because our computers don't help us. Let's switch and talk about one example, a misunderstanding on breath hold. And the reason why this one's important is because if we could control this problem, I believe we could eliminate at least 50%, if not 2/3, of the breath hold fatalities. And we do capture, I started a database when I was in North Carolina, and we were capturing about 100 cases of breath hold fatalities a year. And I think that between half or 2/3 of them could be eliminated if we could get rid of hyperventilation, excessive hyperventilation. And so this is the myth. Some people think that they will have some kind of warning before they black out during breath hold. And that may be completely untrue. So here's where you have to think about core physiology. This is really fundamental stuff, and it makes a good deal of sense. When you hyperventilate before you breath hold, you are getting rid of carbon dioxide. You're lowering the levels. And people don't always appreciate that we have about 160 times the concentration of CO2 in our bodies than we have in the atmosphere. We actually use it for acid-base buffering. So our bodies retain a lot of CO2. When you hyperventilate, which is just breathing in excess of metabolic need, you dramatically drop your CO2 levels. And it's the CO2 that gives us the urge to breathe. So if we get rid of the CO2, we have no urge to breathe. You could pass out without warning. And so the rational view, you have to be very, very thoughtful. And I want to show you this as a figure because this is such an important risk factor in breath hold that I think it's worth spending a bit of time. This is a plot that shows breath hold time on the x-axis, and the blue numbers are partial pressure of carbon dioxide. The yellow is partial pressure of oxygen. And I think everybody understands when you hold your breath, the oxygen content in your body goes down. So if we think of holding your breath, over time, the oxygen content in your body goes down. Understandable. You also will surely understand that when you hold your breath, the carbon dioxide levels will go up. When they hit a certain point, you have the urge to breathe. Well, the neat thing about hyperventilation is not what it does to the oxygen. Another myth that some people believe is that hyperventilation boosts your oxygen stores. It does increase the stores, but not much. Before we get to the actual effect, let's look at this urge to breathe line. If you look, this is the carbon dioxide level at which you get that urge to take a breath. And you can see that as your CO2 reaches about 45, 46 millimeters of mercury, you have an urge to breathe. And that's great. Now, the nice thing about it is that that happens before the yellow line hits this dashed line, and that is the level of oxygen required to maintain consciousness. And so there's a time difference here, and that's the safety buffer with no hyperventilation. So the time between when we have the urge to breathe and when we have insufficient oxygen to maintain consciousness, that's the buffer. So if we're breathing normally, which we do all the time, we are relying on this system to protect us. The trick is what happens with hyperventilation. Hyperventilation is really good at driving down your CO2 levels. So as soon as you hyperventilate, you offset your CO2 levels much lower. So now you can see that the point at which that blue line is crossing the urge to breathe line is pretty much the same time the oxygen is crossing the below here you pass out line. And that's the problem. When you hyperventilate, you are completely obliterating your urge to breathe. Now, if you hyperventilate just a little bit, it's not a problem. And for the US Navy, they set the limit at 2 to 3 full ventilatory exchanges. And I talked about this in a talk once. Somebody got very frustrated. Well, which is it? Is it 2 or is it 3? The beauty of physiology is anybody who gives you an absolute single number is probably full of crap. So we know that if you have the equivalent of 2 to 3 full ventilatory exchanges, you can drop your CO2 enough that you will have longer breath hold time, but probably not so much that you will completely lose the urge to breathe. But it is excessive hyperventilation that is responsible for a lot of the fatalities we see, because hyperventilation works to increase your breath hold time. At rest, it can double it. Even with exercise, it can increase it by 50%. But it's doing it by putting you at risk because it's abolishing that safety buffer that keeps us alive. So that's hyperventilation. And the myths there are you can't rely on an urge to breathe. Some people say, I get an aura. No, that's absolute horse crap. And that second line, by the way, is the difference in your oxygen boost with hyperventilation. Yep, you do get a slight bit of an increase of oxygen when you hyperventilate. That might buy you 3 seconds of breath hold time. And so you can't say it does nothing, but this isn't what hyperventilation does. What hyperventilation does is it gets rid of the CO2 because we have so much more in our body than we have in the atmosphere. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about exercise. And one example here, a myth, scuba diving is good physical exercise. Well, unless you're the person who's schlepping all the tanks and you're doing a lot of it, I'm sorry. Your most experienced divers are doing everything they can to minimize their in-water exercise intensity, which is what you should do. You conserve gas supply, you decrease your inert gas uptake. This is what you want to do. But the reality is anybody who says, yes, scuba is my exercise, you're not getting much high-level exercise. And so the rational view, if you really want to preserve your ability to dive, you have to be thinking about physical activity beyond the diving to make sure that you retain your readiness. So that's just the reality. Okay, a couple of miscellaneous ones. And this is one that comes up every now and then. People will worry when they get a leaky dry suit or BC, but mostly the dry suit, and they think that water in the dry suit will make them sink. And this is a problem conceptually. It's not the water in your dry suit that makes you sink because water floats in water. So if your dry suit has a lot of water in it, it's still in water, it's still floating. It's not the water in the suit that makes you sink, it's the loss of the air bubble. And so if you have a leak and you've got a lot of water in the lower part of your suit, that may not affect your buoyancy at all. But if you say had a rip in a shoulder zipper or a delamination of a shoulder zipper, you could lose the air pocket. That would adversely affect your buoyancy. But water in a dry suit does not make you sink. The only time it's adding a lot more work is when you climb out of the water and all of a sudden you look like the Michelin man who's got really baggy legs. And then you're packing a lot more weight as you try to exit the water. But water in water doesn't make you sink. It's really the air bubble that we worry about. So water is neutrally buoyant, and that may not seem like a big thing, but it's something that comes up and people don't understand. I think it's important to understand what it is that controls your buoyancy, because excess weighting is a huge issue for me. We look at fatalities here, and in probably 50% of our fatalities over the last 35 years, we have divers who did not ditch their weight belt. or they had unditchable weight that was stuck to them. And all things being equal, I think you've got a greater chance of survival if you eliminate that weight. As part of this, I think it's very important that people understand what contributes to their positive and negative buoyancy. And so dry suits can be important. Problem is we can rely on them too much, and some people will dive overweighted because they get used to it and they think their gear can control for it. But when things fail, you can be stacking the odds against you. So it's important to think about where your buoyancy is coming from and think about what would happen if it were to fail. And if your dry suit fails and it's your feet filling with water, it's not a safety hazard. But if you're losing that air pocket, it is. Okay, now I have a question for you. Do you have any myths? Anybody have any favorite myths or facts that you want to test? Something that you thought absolutely we should have talked about tonight. Now's your opportunity.
They have any? How about duck diving on a surface interval after scuba diving?
That's actually a great one. If there are two problems with it, one is the physical exercise. The physical exercise of doing your surface dive can help promote bubble formation. If you think about it, when you're doing that dive and you're kicking hard, you're working hard, you're shaking the pop bottle before you open it. And so the exercise is a problem. And then the depth can be a problem. But I hesitate when I say that, because if you're just in the snorkel zone, so you're diving to 3, 6, maybe even at most 10 feet, from a descent point of view, it doesn't matter. It's the exercise that matters. But if you're going to do a free dive and you're going to pop down to 40, 50, 60 or beyond feet, then that is bad. So bottom line, it's best if you separate your free diving from your scuba diving. And if you're going to do any kind of you said duck diving, it has to be a very low effort dive. And if it's only to 6 or 10 feet, it is a negligible risk. But if there's more physical effort, then the risk goes up. It's just like climbing out of the boat or climbing up a beach post dive. It's increasing your decompression stress because you're at your highest level of inert gas, and now you're shaking the Coke bottle.
Okay, cool. Anybody else have one?
Yeah, Neil, what's the range in your nitrogen uptake, a nice calm dive compared maybe to a dive that's new to you, high current where you're working really hard?
Yeah,
What's the
that's a
difference?
good question. I can give you an exact number because actually measuring the true content is really, really challenging. But if you look at it with a rough point of view, we tend to exchange gas very effectively in the alveoli. So we tend to exchange very effectively. If you are tripling your respiratory rate, your ventilatory rate, you are boosting your inert gas uptake dramatically. I can't give you a number, but it is not impossible that you could increase it by 30, 40, 50% or more. But it's very difficult to measure those values. But we do know conceptually what happens. The more you're exercising, the more gas flow you'll have through the alveoli and the more uptake of inert gas. And so we can surely, just as you saw in that thermal study from the Navy Experimental Diving Unit, we could show you the same plot of data with exercising divers, and we could get the same kind of difference in decompression sickness rates. With exercise, we could double or triple easily. We could increase our risk of DCS, increase our rate of DCS tenfold if we had exercise at the wrong time.
Dr. Pollock, there was another one in the chat, which was, I'm going to just pop it up there, from Rich. People claim they feel less tired when they dive nitrox, even when they use nitrox tables and dive to the limit. I claim BS. Now, Rich, just remember, those are my initials.
So I'm not sure exactly what you're saying, but maybe Neil, you can address that one.
Well, as in most things, there are actually two answers to that. The first answer is if you are diving an identical profile with substantial decompression stress, one on nitrox, one on air, the stress on air will be higher. So it is possible that you might feel less fatigue. That part is true. But if you're diving a very benign profile where you don't have enough decompression stress that a fatigue from that decompression stress is likely, then it's probably mostly placebo effect. We did one of the first dive tests on nitrox in 1991. We were trying to use surface interval oxygen to accelerate decompression. And we had a guy that was so keen that we're using nitrox because he didn't have much hair left. And he also heard that nitrox made your hair grow. And so these stories have been around for a long time. The reality is, if you're talking about a dive with significant decompression stress, nitrox can reduce the decompression stress, which can reduce the fatigue. But if you're talking about a benign dive with minimal stress, it's probably more myth.
Okay, now maybe just to bring that home for a lot of people, for example, I know Rich is a captain up in Tobermory, so let's use an example like the Arabia, which would be 110 feet, say, as a dive. You're maybe doing it for 15, 20 minutes. It's going to be in the high 30s, low 40s. Is that what you would consider a substantial load?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah,
So
on that dive, if you felt better, then there could easily be a decompression factor in there.
Okay.
So let me give you the minimum. If you're talking about diving to 40 feet, 12 or 13 meters, and you dive on nitrox and you say that you feel a lot better, I call horseshit. But no, if you're diving in the 80, 90, 100 foot range, you've got substantially less decompression stress on nitrox than you'd have on air tables, on air. And so it could make a difference. We know that fatigue is one of the symptoms that people experience in decompression stress. And quite often it can be a low grade fatigue. There are other reasons for the fatigue, even getting out of the water. You've got a fluid shift that's dramatic. You lose central volume when you climb out of the water. There are a lot of reasons why people feel fatigued. But if you're diving in the 60 to 110 foot range, you are very probably going to have sufficient decompression stress that it could be perceived.
okay. One of the other things that magically happens when you have a beer after a dive is that you turn into a snorkeler. And so one of the questions was, is there really a significant impact of having one beer after a dive?
Well, again, there are lots of ways to answer this. And I got in trouble once that I said this on a public meeting in Britain, and they were going to hold it out for all time. Beer is a really good rehydrating agent. So here's the bottom line. If you use a light beer with low alcohol, it's actually a good rehydrating agent. It's not the worst thing in the world to drink. But if you have more than one or two or three, and it's possibly masking symptoms, that's a problem. So one beer, and now we also have to make sure that we're speaking the same language on volume. The Brits didn't understand light beer because that was a concept that was completely foreign to them. For them, a light beer just was light in color, but still the highest alcohol content possible. And one beer could be 8 ounces, or depending on where you are, it could be 32. So let's say you're on the low end of that volume spectrum. A single beer, especially a light beer, is not going to be a problem.
Okay, there's another one in the question box that says there is no difference to decophysiology using enriched air 80 versus O2, which I assume means pure O2. Fact or fiction, disregarding the MOD question, of course. So there, if I had to rephrase, I think what this is probably getting at is 80% oxygen gives you less oxygen exposure, but helps you accelerate your decompression almost just as quickly. So is that a fact or a fiction?
It's not fact, but it's also not completely fiction. When you're at the 80% level, you're getting a pretty good gradient for elimination, but your gradient for elimination is better at 100%. And so you have to make the decision based on where you want to start breathing the gas. You can't breathe 100% oxygen as deep. So if your reason for using 80% is so you can breathe it a little bit deeper, then you could maybe wave your hands and say that makes sense. But having a steeper gradient gives you better elimination. So as a simple answer, 100% is better, but it's not always going to be that much better because there's a downside as to where you can breathe it. If you're carrying that as a bailout gas, for example, you're only able to use it in very shallow water, so you're carrying it when you can't use it. That's a cost. And so there are other things that you have to consider. But for sure, if I had a choice between, if I'm at a 6-meter stop, if I had a choice between 80% and 100% oxygen, I would absolutely be going for the 100%.
Okay, good. Oh, Rich said, good. It's always been his practice to have one light beer after a day of diving. Phew! He's happy. Yeah.
Yeah, the trick is, again, one in the volume of one.
And after a day of diving. Most people here have probably bumped into this, but that's a common sort of phrase. You magically turn into a snorkeler after you have a beer of any kind, whether you're on a liveaboard or at a dive resort or whatever. That generally is the rule. And I think probably easiest to apply that rule evenly to everybody than it is to try and ascertain whether Jason had a light beer and, David didn't, and that kind of stuff, right? That's kind of hard for them to sometimes determine. Okay, I see another one in here. You spoke about the importance of being a fit diver. You also have spoken about the risks of exercising after diving. Is there any more guidance on when it is appropriate to exercise?
Yeah, that is one of the most difficult questions to answer because the reality is we like high intensity exercise to give you a training stimulus, to help keep you fit, to preserve your capacity. But the problem is that high intensity exercise is incompatible with diving. And so in a perfect world, your high intensity exercise would be a day apart from diving. So if you're diving every day, it is really difficult to exercise. Now, low intensity exercise you can still do, but the high intensity is difficult. There is some limited data that suggest that one bout of high intensity exercise 24 hours before diving has a protective effect. And the reason for that could be because that stimulus of the exercise actually stimulates responses that when you subsequently dive, it diminishes the response to the stress of diving. So think of heat shock protein as an example. When we do a high intensity bout of exercise and then we do a dive, when we do the dive, we're less responsive to the stress because our bodies have said, okay, this idiot's doing again, I won't overreact. So there's a very limited body of evidence that suggests 24 hours before is beneficial. When we get closer to dive time, the literature is incredibly ambiguous. And I actually have a doctoral student who's supposed to be working on this question. I call it the zone of uncertainty, and I encourage avoidance of high intensity exercise in the 24 hours preceding the dive. But of course, life gets in the way, so you have to find a rational balance. If you know you're going to be exercising pre-dive or post-dive, you should be modifying your exposure to reduce the risk. That's the compromise. But unfortunately, the two aren't compatible. High intensity exercise and diving is not truly compatible.
You quoted the 24 hours pre. Is that also sort of a good
it is a good rule of thumb. It's a good rule of thumb post. And some people will say, hey, look, I'm a lifelong runner. I run every day. I'm actually less concerned about those people because those people also know what is a normal pain and what is an abnormal pain. And so they will often, one of the things that is somewhat diagnostic of decompression sickness is when you ask people to characterize the pain, it's often somewhat different from what they felt before. If they say this feels just like, then the likelihood of DCS goes down. But if they say, this feels just a little bit different from what I felt before, the possibility of DCS goes up. And so for a lifelong runner who says they're going to run every day, A, you try to encourage them to reduce the decompression stress on the dive, and B, you rely on their familiarity with their own bodies and responses to be honest in evaluating their state.
Cool. Another question that popped up has to do probably with meal choices. This person, just for context, quoted C.L. Mart's The Fitness for Divers study in 2005, stated that a light sushi meal before a dive is an ideal meal prior to dive due to the striking a good balance between fats, lean protein, carbohydrates, and an adequate amount of salt. So the question was, in essence, do meal choices, even in a minor way, affect DCS or decompression stress?
They have more of an impact on your energetics. There's something called specific dynamic action. When you're consuming protein and you're metabolizing protein, you actually see a boost in the metabolic rate by 10 to 15%. So you can hand wave in saying having reasonable protein in your diet, which, by the way, doesn't take much protein for this to be effective. But with a small bit of protein, you might actually get a little bit better caloric response. Beyond that, it gets difficult. What's most important is you have a reasonably well-balanced diet so that your energetics and your nutritional standards are met. If you do that, you're probably fine. The salt is funny. We don't have a minimum daily requirement for salt. So anybody says I need a salty meal because that will make me safer, that one doesn't track. But to have a reasonable amount of protein, to not go too light on your nutrient content, has some theoretical benefits. There's also a study, a fellow Jacobson and Robert reported a study in, I think it was 1967, and they actually looked at the nitrogen content of the blood after a fatty meal and a non-fatty meal. So they extracted blood, and what they showed is that the fats were circulating in the blood were holding more nitrogen, and so more was being carried. And they suggested that indicated that a fatty meal would have more decompression stress. But that's a little bit misleading because fat does have a higher solubility for inert gas, but that doesn't mean when it's circulating in the blood that it's going to translate into delivery to the tissues. And so there's not a lot of good evidence. That was, as I said, a paper that was reported in 67. We don't have much on the nutritional side. One of the things that was a bit of a follow-up, in 1978, a paper was studied or was published, and they looked at cholesterol levels. And what they found is that divers with high cholesterol levels were more likely to be bubble prone as people with lower cholesterol levels. That work actually needs to be redone because now we do a much better job of getting subfractions of cholesterol. It's possible there's still a story to tell there, but it's not well studied because we have limited research dollars and you've got an infinite combination of nutrient intake. And so this is just not an area that you can easily study.
Now, we often hear about don't eat high fatty meals before a dive. Is that often more for like motion sickness and how your stomach's going to feel as opposed to decompression stress related?
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's being comfortable during the dive. If you are comfortable eating that meal, no problem. Or if you're comfortable clearing your regulator from vomit, you don't have that much of a problem.
Yeah, I can do it. I have a question, Bruce.
Yeah, there's a question here.
Hello, Dr. Pollock. As a mature female diver with controlled hypertension on antihypertensive, is it myth or fact that I'm at higher risk to be a diver?
Yeah, if the hypertension is controlled, you probably are at similar risk. And so the controlled hypertension is the reality. We're actually just publishing a paper right now looking at arterial dissection. And hypertension is a risk factor, but you can largely eliminate it when it's controlled.
And what would be the danger if you went diving and you had high blood pressure or your blood pressure spiked? What would there be an in-dive problem that you'd encounter?
Yeah. One of the major concerns, if you think about someone who's immersing themselves in water, you get a shift of blood to the thorax. And so the capacitance vessels of your legs hold 50% of your blood volume. So when you immerse your body in water, you get a squeezing of those vessels, you get a return of blood to the thorax. That increased end diastolic volume means that your heart is working harder, because your heart responds by Starling's law. The more it stretches during diastole, the harder it contracts during systole. And so for someone who is hypertensive and they immerse themselves in water, you're putting added strain on the system because they're already overpressurizing the system a little bit. And now you've got that hydrostatic shift, which is overpressurizing more. And it is possible that someone who's close to their physiological limit, just by immersing themselves in water, could put them over the edge. And this is why over age 35, one of the biggest factors, one of the biggest causes that we see in diving fatalities are cardiac issues. And so if people have a low reserve, just putting them in the water is a significant stressor. And someone who's hypertensive is at greater risk. But again, if you're normotensive, through medication, you've largely eliminated that risk factor. And no one is going to do a controlled study because of the ethics involved. We're not going to take hypertensive people. We have a hard time getting volunteers for that kind of study. We think you're more likely to die if you're hypertensive. And so, no, we don't know. So we're not going to get the data, but for sure, controlled hypertension is largely an equalizer.
One of the other ones that I've heard before, probably always good to raise, skin bends aren't serious.
That depends. If you have just the itching and the rash, especially if you say jumped into a shower or a hot tub after you dive, those are relatively unimportant. It doesn't mean that you can't have other problems, but those are mild skin bends. If the skin symptoms organize into what's called cutis marmorata, where they start to look like an artistic pattern of shapes, that's actually often presaging the onset of neurological symptoms. So if your skin symptoms are a little bit of itchiness, a little bit of redness, slight rash, they're relatively mild. But if they get organized to cutis, figure out where you should be going for treatment.
Okay, interesting. There's a couple others here that are coming in, which I will push out. And I know you've sat on the review committee for the new medical forms that are part of the WRSTC. So this is a good one. If somebody is on blood thinners, is there a maximum depth they must limit themselves to? Of course, the question of limits on these medical forms is always an interesting one, but practically speaking, forget the form for a moment. Is there a limit, or should we be thinking about that?
Yeah, well, I want to go back now to finish off something on the hypertension question. I talked about immersing the body in water. The majority of the effect occurs when you're immersed, even to the neck. So depth doesn't play a role. You have the same risk in shallow water that you would have in deep water. And now if we move to the blood thinners, you have the same risk. The difference, if you're doing deeper, longer dives, especially if they're associated with decompression, is that there's a greater likelihood that you're going to have a ceiling that you can't violate. If you have a problem when you have a decompression ceiling, you have a much bigger problem. So it's not that there's an absolute risk, but the likelihood of insult and injury that could lead to bleeding is significant, and that is considered a relatively unacceptable risk. That's a strong relative contraindication.
Okay. Question, is there any recent updated studies on asthma and diving? So oftentimes we hear asthmatics can't dive, you know.
Yeah, that was a conventional wisdom. There are two things on that as well. If you were diagnosed at some point as having childhood asthma, and as an adult, you've never used a rescue inhaler, you're not on any medication, you haven't any problems, that childhood diagnosis is probably irrelevant. If you are active asthmatic and you require a rescue inhaler, there are good reasons to appreciate that your relative risk is substantially elevated. So much depends. If you have asthma that is only activated during seasonal, say during pollen season, if you don't need the rescue inhaler on a regular basis, you may very well not have a problem with diving. So there's a fair bit of latitude for individual case state.
Okay.
But certainly, once you've been 5 years free, when you've been 5 years free, you haven't used a rescue inhaler, then your risk pretty much goes back to normal. And at that point, for a lot of people, they would not view it as contraindication.
Okay. Another question, how about precipitating factors for IPE? I've always attempted to get people out of the water as quickly as possible if they are suspected of IPE. Does that make sense?
Yes, IPE is a multifactorial condition. It really is driven by fluid volume, inspiratory pressures, workload, and if we think about those varying factors, immersing a naked swimmer, so somebody in a bathing suit in water, is causing that shift of blood to the thorax. That's increasing your risk. Hyperhydration, drinking a lot of water or fluid, increases the risk. Wearing a tight wetsuit means that you have to work really hard to inhale against that tight wetsuit. That's increasing the risk. Breathing resistance on any breathing circuit increases the risk, more so with depth because your respired gas density is going up. Trim is a factor. If you're optimally trimmed, you have a low static lung load. But if you're out of trim, you can have a greater resistance to breathing. And so you've got a lot of factors that can influence you. For the specific question of should we get them out of the water quicker, getting them out of the water quicker is reducing the hydrostatic drive of extra fluid volume to the chest, unless they're wearing a super tight wetsuit, and then it's the same as the water. And so it's not just getting out of the water, it's getting them out of that super tight wetsuit.
Which presumably is easier to get them out of when you're out of the water. So it would seem the practice seems like a good one.
Oh yeah, there's absolutely no doubt, because it's involving the respiratory system. Getting them out of the water is definitely a good thing, and getting rid of any restrictions on their chest and neck is a very good thing. Putting them on oxygen, they probably want to be seated upright for comfort, and if it's a mild case, they tend to resolve quite nicely. But if it's not treated effectively, or it's a serious case, it can be a life threat. So managing it fairly expeditiously is important, but where you have to consider, or what you have to consider, is some of the other implications. For example, if you have somebody who's a technical diver and they develop IPE symptoms on the way up and they've got a substantial decompression obligation, I would not be shorting the decompression to get them to the surface. To me, the priority would be making sure they didn't have unmanageable decompression stress, because it is probably the priority.
Right.
But if you have somebody who isn't blowing off decompression, they're on the surface, then yeah, getting them out of the water is the right thing to do.
Okay. There was another question about full face masks, which I'll come back to in a second, but related to the IPE question, does hypertension factor into IPE at all?
Yes. Hypertension is one of the risk factors. Yeah, anything that drives up your pulmonary artery pressure is a risk factor. So yes, if you're hypertensive, you're at greater risk.
Okay.
Women have been shown to be at greater risk of IPE. I think it's possible that that is confounded because women tend to be better hydrators than men. And so I think we've got some confounding there. But yes, hypertension is one of the risk factors of IPE.
Okay. There was one in here, not so much diving, although sort of water related. Full face snorkeling masks are death masks.
That depends on the quality of the mask. There are some that work pretty well. They've got one-way valves that work, and so they minimize the dead space. And when you exhale, it is being dumped overboard. But there are a lot of knockoff masks that are poor that you can end up rebreathing a lot of CO2. And yes, those are very risky. I do not encourage full face masks, but if you are going to use them, the highest quality masks that have effectively working one-way valves that ensure that when you're exhaling, you're dumping that gas overboard and not into the oronasal space that you can rebreathe from would be better.
Okay. I was on a dive trip recently, and one of the observations, so one of the people that was on a boat at the operation we were at developed skin bends, was I'm going to say, middle-aged woman, probably sort of late 50s, slightly overweight. And the operator said, oh, we're seeing that a lot more lately, middle-aged women developing skin bends, because they tend to be in the slightly overweight category. Now, his observation, not mine. Just wondering if there is any sort of, again, myth versus reality. Is that something that, hey, it's easy to categorize types of bends by physiology or gender or that kind of thing, or is that just a complete, fallacy?
It's difficult to say. There are a couple of things to unpack there. One, if you're talking about premenopausal women, there is a possibility that they are at slightly higher physiological risk in the first half of the menstrual cycle. Some of the work that's come out of the aviation community has shown that for the nursing or technical staff in chambers, they are at higher risk in that first half of the cycle. And that's probably driven hormonally. We don't see those same patterns in diving, but it's because, unlike the people in the chamber, divers are under their own control. And so they can choose to come up when they want to come up. They can do longer stops if they want to do longer stops. And I think we can probably accept that it's more likely the male who's going to be yelling, hey, watch this, than the female. And so females are inherently more intelligent than males. And so they're probably not being as silly in their decompression profile. For that reason, even if women have a slightly higher physiological risk, they probably have a much lower behavioral risk than males. So having extra fat, is it associated with skin bends? Is there a risk? It's possible, but it's also possible if they're using rental wetsuits that they have a problem of not cleaning their suits adequately and they're getting some skin reaction. I don't know the case you were in, but if they're suddenly seeing a whole bunch of people who are doing this, I'd be asking the question, is there anything else that's in common for them?
Yeah. And there were some other factors. I oversimplified, but yes. Now, somebody asked a question. Oh, Rich said, ouch. Yes. Somebody asked a question, are cold baths after a sauna beneficial to condition physiology? I'm not sure if there's a second part of that, but you're smiling, so it seems like a question you've been asked before.
Yeah, well, as long as it doesn't kill you, yes, it's fine. So is there any real benefit? You can go to Scandinavia where it's almost a religious practice to do the snow bath after you get out of the hot tub. And as long as it doesn't kill you, it's fine. You just have to be aware. You can vagal out. There's something called a vasovagal response. If you jump into cold water, you may do well for 4 minutes, 6 minutes, maybe 8 minutes. But there comes a point when you can get a drop in your blood pressure and you can pass out without warning. And so if you're going to do that, I would say go in screaming and keep your energy level high and then get out in a reasonable period of time. I actually studied cold acclimatization in the Antarctic, and to boost the odds on finding good success, I would actually take a bath in the ice hole every other day for the entire season. So that's -2 degrees seawater. And I jump in and out 4 times. And I was fine jumping in and out, but you couldn't get me to stay still in that water for any length of time because I wiggled out 4 times in lab studies or having blood drawn. And I know that my body can betray me. So there's nothing inherent if it's done quickly and with high energy, but if you are hypertensive, ill shape, and you have cardiac risk, it's probably not the best choice.
All right, there you go. Good. Any other questions from the gang here or anybody from online? Oh, there's another one. Quick general question before the meeting ends. There was a 3070 GF and a 3085 GF shown on the slides. 3070 is a standard sort of preset option on some dive computers. Would you consider this to be a generally safe, conservative GF setting for most dives?
Yeah, and first off, in the slides, I actually showed 1585 and 3070. And I can
Right.
give you a history on that. When Shearwater made their computers, they went to the technical diving community, and they were told that basically 3085 was reasonable. That's just doing the poll. That's what they found. A lot of people were going to GF high of 85. When we did 7 years of field dive monitoring, where we would go out with technical divers and we would measure them after the dives, we didn't control what they did, but we were able to measure them post dive. What we found is that people who were bubble prone, if they went from GF high of 85 to 70, we would see a 1 to 2 grade drop in bubble scores. And this was on an 8 to 9 point scale. And so Shearwater changed their defaults from 3085 to 3070. So that was based on the data we had at the time. I now dive 4070 and added extra buffers because I think that is legitimate, but the 3070 came because that's where we had the data.
Okay.
And it was much more conservative than the 85. The GF low matter number isn't as important. I think once you get over 30, whether it's 40, 30, it really doesn't make that much difference on a normal ascent profile. But anything less than 30 to me is an unacceptable deep stop. And some people even like 50 or higher. I am not comfortable there because if you do plot your dives looking at 40 and 50, I like a 3 meter deeper stop for that first stop. And the difference is small, but I'm very comfortable with 4070 and then adding extra buffer. And I'm not uncomfortable with 3070 still. I think for standard ascent profile, it's fine. You couldn't convince me. I mean, I'm not 20 years old anymore. In my 20s, I certainly did a lot of dives, and if I did it now, I'd be a pretzel. But I figure I have been lucky for enough decades that I would not choose to dive a gradient factor higher than 70. It's just not worth it to me. I don't mind extra water time, but I'm not interested in decompression sickness. And 3565, that's fine. If you actually do the math, you check the difference when you do the 5% increments, they are pretty negligible. So I'll tell you what I do for if I have the flexibility of time, I will dive 4070, but I actually increase my shallow stop time. And I consider it a failure if my GF surface is not less than 50 when I get out. And if I can hang around in the shallow stops and come out with it less than 30, I'm happy. For me, that's all cheap insurance. And so one of the nice things you have on some computers now is the GF surface. It tells you what your gradient factor would be if you went direct to the surface right now. And that to me is a very insightful number. And I really love seeing that count down because that's just comfortable buffer. To watch it drop below 60, 50, 40, 30, it's great. It really doesn't take that long before you can get it down below 20. And if I'm somewhere where I can hang out in shallow water, I see no penalty in that.
Cool. One other one, and then we'll probably wrap things up. there was, oops, here it is. Dan states the key to safe diving is physical fitness, not age, which I'm interpreting as my Garmin fitness age versus biological age. How much can fitness offset age-related diving concerns?
Well, for sure, physiological age is very different from chronological age for some people. But how much it will offset, there's no way to answer that unless you've studied yourself. I'll use myself as an example again. I started doing ultrasonic assessment of bubbles in 1985. And so I've scanned myself completely for the last, 35 years. I bubble now much more readily. I never used to bubble, but time catches up to you. And so the more physiological fit you are, you get a buffer, a benefit. But age is a great equalizer. Eventually it catches up to you. And let me turn the question, look at fatality data. When we look at fatalities in diving, we quite often see a big discrepancy between male and female fatality rates younger than 55. Often that's because a fair number of the males tend to make decisions that put them in trouble. After age 55, there's a great equalizer, and that's probably medical health. At that point, you're not quite as, by 55, most males are at least getting close to being out of adolescence. And so they're maybe a little bit less crazy. And it's the medical things that can catch up to both sexes. But you can't pin your hopes on physiological age. Being fit is good, but I also know a number of divers who do very, very well. They're not supremely fit, but they have been blessed with being fairly decompression resistant. And it's hard to factor all of that in. I'll think of one person right now who actually has a reputation of diving in board shorts and a t-shirt. And so his entire career, that's how he does deep technical dives to 300, 400 feet. And he freezes his ass off on the bottom, but it's become his thing. And so he's stuck with it. But there's an advantage of that. He's so chilled at the bottom, it reduces his inert gas uptake. So even though he's not a spring chicken anymore, he tends not to bubble much. And it's very possibly less fitness and more his thermal status during the dive that is most protective. So there are ways you can manipulate even if you are not optimal in one category. But the three categories most important are your dive profile, thermal status, and your exercise. Physiological age, if you can be younger, if you convince yourself of that, that's great. But I wouldn't bet the bank on it.
Okay. There's a couple more quick questions. Maybe we just make sure we do them quick. Where would one find good information about evaluating bubble concentrations with Doppler?
Yeah, I can send you a paper, Brad, and you can pass it on. I did a review paper on the ultrasound, and we also have one on standards. I'll send you a couple papers. You're welcome to share them.
Okay. And one other, is it the upper factor that limits the bottom time? I usually end up with a mandatory 10-foot stop when diving to 100 feet using 30-70.
Yeah, well, definitely the GF high is giving you your biggest drop on the total time. So yes, that's the simplest answer.
Okay.
And you could say, well, gee, I want more time. The other people are doing it. For me, it's all about buffers. There's so much wild card element in diving. You don't know how cold you'll be. You don't know how hard you're going to work. You don't know so many things. I think buffers are really cheap insurance. So I would hang on to that GF high of 70 and continue to add more buffers, because it's much better to spend a little bit more time in the water and not have to spend all that time traveling to and then being treated in a hyperbaric unit.
Okay, cool.
And I see another question here: how to volunteer for studies.
Yeah.
If you're close to a facility, then you can do it. For example, even at Downsview, Toronto, they may be doing more validation studies of the Shearwater computer implementation of DCIM tables. It's possible there'll be some human trials there. If you're anywhere close to my neck of the woods, you're welcome to volunteer for studies. You really have to look and see what's available in your area. And if not diving studies, I encourage people to look at exercise physiology studies, because then you can get your fitness assessed. And that is also a useful tool to see how it changes over time.
Good. All right.
And
well,
how do oh,
go ahead.
last one I see here. How do you increase your thermal status at depth? It's you increase your risk thermally if you're warm at the bottom, because you're taking on more inert gas. And so for people who use active heating garments, if you're going to use them, I would recommend you keep them at the lowest lowest setting during the descent and bottom phase, and then you would slowly increase them during the ascent and stop phase. So you increase your stress when you're heating on the bottom. You decrease your stress when you're cool on the bottom. If you're diving somewhere where you're coming up over a thermocline and you hit warm water in the shallows, that's actually protective. That's good. Take advantage of that warm water because it's promoting peripheral circulation, which helps you clear out inert gas.
Cool. Well, guys, thank you very much. Dr. Pollock, we'll give you a bit of a round of applause. Thank you, as always.
Thank you.
Really great to have you with us again. Always entertaining and educational and informative. Always neat to test some myths and facts too. So it's nice that we were able to do some interactive stuff at the end. Guys, I always sort of let people know Dr. Pollock and I are, in contact. So if you have any other questions, I can always pass them on for you. He'll get me a study. Said he'd get me a study or two. I saw Tom was asking about that, so I'll pass that along. But if you do have any other questions, let me know and I'll try and facilitate an answer for you.
Now, one question that did come up earlier was osteoporosis in diving. And
oh, yes,
for people who have osteoporosis, the biggest concern is that the burden can worsen it, the weight burden. And so if you have osteoporosis and you want to dive, it may be that you should be thinking about valet diving, where you get dressed in the water and undressed in the water and somebody is carrying all your gear. There is no, in the water, you're well supported. There's no real evidence that osteoporosis is going to be risky in terms of decompression stress. Having said that, I wouldn't be trying to set any records on depth, because yes, you've got bones that are fragile. You don't want to abuse it, but I'd say the same thing for anybody. Nobody should be having such high decompression stress that we're worried about dysbaric osteonecrosis. This, by the way, is the real problem why I like to add buffers. You can get away with mild symptoms or even be on the edge and not be aware of symptoms once, but if you are close to that clinical edge, you could be developing small insults that over the next 10 or 20 years can result in dysbaric osteonecrosis. If that occurs near a joint, it will lead to full joint collapse. The way to avoid that is to make sure you have the buffers so you're not suffering from undue stress. And if you're not suffering from undue stress, if you had thinning of the bone, and as long as you didn't have to schlep all that gear in and out and you could be well supported, put it on in the water, take it off in the water, I would have no major concerns.
Cool. Good. Well, guys, thanks everybody for coming. And our next Winter Wednesday, well, we've actually got a couple coming up closer to the end of February. We have Brian Horn from Curacao. It's coming on the 20th. On the 21st, we have the folks from Fourth Element that'll be here talking about not only their brand as a whole, but their whole ocean positive line. They're basically using ghost fishing nets to make their products, their thermal products. So they're going to spend some time talking about some of that, which is very interesting, not only conservation, but a very responsible corporate, stance. And they're also going to do a demonstration on how they use biomapping for fitting you for a dry suit. They take 2 photographs and they will create a perfectly fitting dry suit for you based on those 2 and 3D imaging. So it's kind of an interesting way. So they're going to just sort of show just very quickly how easy that is in terms of a process. And then, so that's on the 21st. And then on the 22nd, 3 nights in a row, Charles DuPont is going to be here from Paddy Canada doing sort of he and I are going to do a bit of a live your adventure
hey, what do you want to accomplish in diving? How do you get there? We're going to be interviewing some staff members that have done so. My son Blake and a couple of other folks that are going to talk a little bit about their own personal adventure in diving. It doesn't necessarily have to be a professional one. It could be just, hey, I want to become a rescue diver and I'm not a diver, or I'm an open water diver. What should I do? So sort of a bit of a chat about, hey, what do you want to accomplish in diving and what would be a good way to get there? So Charles is a great guy and has been with PADI Canada for probably 8 or